is the opportunity.
High fly ball, deep left field. Oh, 27 does it again.
God, Fernando Tatis Jr. with a 2-run shot has the Padres on the board.
Go. That's his 11th driven out to deep center field. Going back, Springer turning, looking, see ya! Oh, what a shot by Judge! The Yankees lead 1-0.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first ever baseball show. My name is Davis Bird, and I'm joined today by Jake Crumpler and Isaiah Hansen. And this is our first ever baseball show. Free baseball presented by the Athletes Hub. It's going to be more of our love letter to baseball. We're going to cover everything from trade rumors, free agency, regular season when it happens, the Hall of Fame, and even fantasy baseball. So I'll just get right into it, and we'll start with the latest news, I guess, from last week, and it's Rob Manfred and Ken Rosenthal not being renewed at MLB Network because of his criticism of Rob Manfred. So I'll start it off with Jake. What are your thoughts about Rob Manfred and the situation as a whole?
Well, I definitely think it's important to point out first how long Ken Rosenthal was with MLB Network. He was there for 13 years, covering games in person, on the field, and in MLB Tonight and that kind of stuff, their biggest show. And that his contract ran up last off season. So he was going into this year under no contract. And I think the biggest thing to point out after Manfred fired him is that, Rosenthal, his comments on Manfred weren't that detrimental. They weren't like personal attacks or anything. It was just like, I don't think Manfred is doing too well trying to set up the season for the 2020 season when it took until August 31st for the season to begin. So I definitely think there was a lot of unreasonable being upset with Rosenthal over his comments. What do you think, Isaiah?
Yeah, as a Knicks fan, we just got done with the basketball podcast. It reminds me a lot of James Dolan and kicking Charles Oakley out, just little things like that. And now, but the problem with this, that's the front runner for the Knicks. Okay. But we got the commissioner of the Major League Baseball, a league that we all hold closely to our hearts. And, you got your feelings hurt, I guess. And we also, by the way, we're added to that list of being fired because I think that's probably going to undo any chances we have of working for them as well. And you fire one of the best in the business, being Ken Rosenthal. That's a bit of a stretch for me. It's a bit sensitive. I mean, it's one thing if your league is running well and, he said anything, out of the ordinary. But as Jake pointed out, what did he really say? There wasn't much other than what everybody else has been saying. He just simply echoed what the fans have been saying. In fact, he was kind of light on it. If we were echoing it, you see what our chat was looking like after he was let go. You had Dev over there doing his thing, completely knocking down Ken Rosenthal. So, unfortunately, it's simply a highlight of how he's kind of done his job as a commissioner. I hate to say it, but we're currently under a lockout, so there's not much that can really be fought the other way until we get the season going on. There's a lot of issues to be pointed out with the MLB. I'm sure we'll get to it over time, over the weeks that we do this show. What do you think, Davis?
Well, I think it underscores the point that the network is league owned when you have the God Emperor himself, Rob Manfred, knocking down Ken Rosenthal, who's universally beloved by players, other reporters, and fans. Plus, it's just exacerbated by the fact that there is a lockout and there's no other news other than the Hall of Fame to glom onto. It's just all right, well, Rob Manfred looks like an egotistical maniac now because he let Rosenthal go because he criticized him. And, Rob Manfred's not liked. It's not a secret. Not really anyone likes Rob Manfred other than the owners because he works for them. And that's the point. He's the commissioner of baseball and he works with owners and he works to serve his own interest and their own interests. So anything that makes them look bad is like public enemy number one in his eyes. So it's just, I don't know. It's frustrating because you see someone with high journalistic integrity like Ken Rosenthal that is, like I said, universally beloved. And I know a lot of players were speaking out on his behalf. I know Tyler Matzik said something about him. It's such a bad look for MLB when there's nothing else going on.
Yeah, and you see Deb pointing out Goodell over Manfred, and that's such a crazy thought to believe that there's not really an argument that you can make for Manfred, in my opinion. I mean, I'm sure somebody somewhere can, but not too many people are making them. So that's a weird thought just to,
Yeah, it's almost a high crime to be worse than Goodell, but
yeah.
Yeah, Manfred is just so out of touch with the players that I think it's hard for people to want to take his side when they hear him doing press conferences and calling the World Series trophy a hunk of metal and things like that, where it just seems like he doesn't really care about baseball. He just cares about the negotiations for the new CBA and making sure that the owners get the most money out of it when they do come to a conclusion. But I think that's one of the reasons why it took so long for the season to start last year or in 2020, not in 2021, was because Manfred was doing such a not amazing job of attempting to make it the best situation for the owners rather than make it a good place for the players to play, a safe and good place for the players to play, and a good product for fans to watch.
Yeah, I completely agree with that point. And almost exactly to that effect, Rob Manfred, it's him and the owners versus everyone else is what it feels like ever since then. And that's really brought that to light. And I think that's really escalated the criticism of Rob Manfred. Everyone kind of thought he sucked before. He said World Series is a hunk of metal, everything like that. And then it's just, you delay last season and now you have probably the ugliest lockout in 20 something years. It's really such a terrible look in the middle of that to let Ken Rosenthal go very publicly. And I know the reports came out that he'd basically been in the doghouse since those comments came out, but now making it really public is just so bad.
And it's really tough because we're going to kind of transition in a little bit like to the Hall of Fame discussions.
Yeah.
But I think we're all doing this show because, like you said, this is kind of like a love letter to Major League Baseball. We love baseball, right? We always talk about baseball. We love baseball, but the history of our sport is tarnished time and time again. And Manfred continues to add on to it from his handling of the Astros situation. In my opinion, that's one of the ones that sticks out to me even now. And to, just look at the Hall of Fame ballot. Like, it's not a good look. And I understand. And I'm not going to really stick up too much for Pete Rose because I don't think he's that good of a human being, to be honest. But it's not a good look when your all-time hitter, all-time leader in hits and your all-time leader in home runs are not in the Hall of Fame. And I guess that's a good note to transition, Davis.
Yeah. So bridging into the Hall of Fame discussion, I know there's a lot of talk going on about how weird the ballot is. I know everyone kind of skews more towards is Bonds going to get in? Is Clemens going to get in? Is Sosa going to get in? The answer to that's no. But the biggest riser is David Ortiz. We were talking about that before the show and about how me and Jake were personally really surprised that David Ortiz was the lead vote getter. Why don't you share your thoughts about that, Jake?
Yeah, I was incredibly surprised to see David Ortiz leading all vote getters at 83.8% with 37.8% of the ballots known, thanks to Ryan Thibodeau on Twitter. But I was super surprised not because he doesn't have the resume to be in the Hall of Fame. He's got over 500 home runs. He's one of the greatest postseason hitters, but because he he didn't play in the field. He was a designated hitter throughout his career, so that makes his most comparable player who's in the Hall of Fame already is Edgar Martinez, who was also a DH for the majority of his career. Also, obviously came up as a third baseman and played some first base. But Martinez took 10 full years, the whole time allotted for players on the ballot at this point, to finally get inducted into the Hall of Fame. And that makes me very surprised to see Ortiz at 83%, because I'm pretty sure Edgar Martinez started around 30%, which led me to believe Ortiz would be somewhere around there, probably higher because of that postseason resume. But in the end, it's very surprising to see Ortiz that high, and with almost 50% of the ballots, like, it's going to take almost people actively try not to get him in to get him under that 75%.
So, basing off your argument, what do you, and the facts that you presented, how much do you think postseason success factors in with a lot of the voters, especially, I think there's a weird mix of voters because they're all baseball writers, that some of them are still old kind of traditionalists. Postseason stats matter, counting stats matter, versus advanced analytics guys more along the lines of like an Andrew Jones and like Scott Rowland. Do you think that it's kind of outweighing one or the other, with Ortiz just honestly commanding the lead at the top? Like, how important?
You want to go ahead and take it, Isaiah?
Yeah, how important do you think those postseason stats are?
I think it's big time. I think another factor, like playoffs, narratives, and what team you played for, let's be honest, plays a factor. A lot of people like to throw the arguments at Derek Jeter, and I'm not going to take any of it, but let me just say there is some credence. Like, if Derek Jeter played for the Seattle Mariners, for example, would he be held in as high of a regard as he did? You talk about Edgar Martinez and David Ortiz, relatively similar numbers. Edgar Martinez actually played the field, and you got David Ortiz leading the way, mainly because he played for Boston. Of course, he was a great character. Not everybody is a fan, but even as a Yankee fan, I actually respect the person that was David Ortiz and his love for the game and his commentating. So the narrative matters, the playoffs matter, and of course, what team he played for. He played for the Red Sox, which is a really highly regarded team, not by me. I'm a Yankee fan, but you got to give it up to the Red Sox. And, everything seems to be a little bit more amplified when you're over there. So the postseason does matter. You got to have rings, and you don't have to have rings to make the playoffs. But in the words of the writers, to be in their good graces, to get like the little extra edge like you see with David Ortiz right now, I think the postseason absolutely matters. And David Ortiz is, he was at the front lines of the Red Sox success in 2010s.
Yeah, I definitely think it's fair to say that not only do players get more experience playing in the postseason, but they get more known. They're seen more often. They're on TV more often. They're talked about more by analysts and stuff during the playoffs and that kind of stuff. So I think that already gets them on people's minds. And you can definitely get held back by just not appearing in the postseason, because it just means that the less mainstream fans are not seeing you. Like David Ortiz was seen so much because he was in the playoffs, but somebody like if Ortiz had remained with the Twins, who he was drafted by, he may not have had the same success and may not have even the opportunity to show what kind of postseason player he could be, because the Twins have been knocked out in the first round every single year. So, yeah.
Right. And I completely agree. And bridging into my own argument that I've seen personally, a lot like with the ballot tracker, you have the top three of David Ortiz, Barry Bonds, and Roger Clemens. But then you have a couple of the guys that are right on the precipice, like Scott Rowland, and the one that I want to talk about, Billy Wagner. Postseason stats are used as more of a detriment towards Billy Wagner. He had I think it was a 10.08 ERA in the postseason through, I want to say it was 13 games. But how much does that factor in towards taking a player out of it when they have a lack of postseason success but are so dominant for a stretch like Billy Wagner? You could make the argument Billy Wagner's probably the third best reliever that's ever played. Mariano Rivera is obviously number one, and Trevor Hoffman. But when you look at advanced stats, Billy Wagner and Trevor Hoffman have really comparable win probability added in the postseason, and Trevor Hoffman's in the Hall of Fame, but Billy Wagner isn't. And so that's more of my argument as to why someone should be in. Who's one that you think is on the precipice that really needs to be in? What's your selling point for your guy?
You know, it's tough when you talk about guys that are on the precipice. Like, I mean, I would love to go ahead and talk about Andy Pettitte right now because that's my guy. You know, that's my favorite starting pitcher of all time. You know, he should be in there in my opinion. But I'm going to wait a couple of years. But you know, I'm thinking of a guy like Andrew Jones. Man, it's one of those things where you know you have two tails of a career. Like I look at Vince Carter in the NBA, like two tails. One as an elite level guy, and then you go to another organization, and you know injuries happen, and you kind of fall apart. But when he was in his prime, Andrew Jones, you could argue, is a like if we just took his prime, his peak, and his level of play, you could argue he's a top 5 guy. Get the steroid guys out of that conversation, and you talk about a top 5 player. But you know, I think you know to answer your question about guys like Billy Wagner too. Maybe some players in the future have to think about like if you stick around for too long, by the time you get on that ballot, it just seems like it's been forever. And maybe the memory of how good you were just simply goes away a little bit. Because, you know, maybe that's why, because when Ortiz last played, he was still, you know, he could still go out there and do what he's always done. He could still smack homers.
He led the league in doubles his last year.
Yeah, I mean, like he didn't really need to be exposed because he never played defense, you know, so he wasn't into the defense anyway. But I think maybe that's what the league. It's just the writers are it's just narrative driven. I do feel like there needs to be like a bit of a change as to how the votes are tallied. I mean, I don't know if it should be just baseball writers. I do think like current Hall of Famers have a right to say who is in there. Like I think we were discussing about Barry Bonds. It might have not even been you guys, but you know how it's going to be for his speech if he does make it, and you see the Hall of Famers behind him. Is it going to be like an awkward situation? You know, he's probably going to get booed if he does get in. But so I feel like there needs to be a bit of an overhaul as to how these guys are getting in my opinion.
Yeah, I think you can see that kind of voting in the Veterans Committee where you get people that aren't writers, and so like that's how you have the 10 years of Hall of Fame where you're getting voted in by writers, and then afterwards you're not being voted in by writers. You're being voted in by executives and former players and former managers and that kind of stuff. But going to a player that I think deserves it, the previously mentioned Scott Rowland, I think is the biggest. He's at 71.6% on of ballots. Which gives him a shot at making it in next year. But if he stays at that number, or this year, but if he stays at that number, he's definitely getting in next year. And it's a result of the 7 Gold Gloves he's won at third base, which I think is the 4th most all time. He's got well over 300 home runs and was a great hitter during his time. Like I know it was post steroid era in early 2000s, so he doesn't really stand out amongst his contemporaries because he's obviously playing as a teammate of Albert Pujols during his prime. So that makes it seem like he wasn't the biggest star that he was. But when you go and you look at his stats, he's just up there in so many different stats that he deserves to be in just by being one of the best third basemen of all time. Like he's clearly top 10 third baseman. And to talk about the previously mentioned guys that you guys mentioned, Wagner's at 48.6%. And according to Jaws, which is a statistic that measures out how likely a player is to make the Hall of Fame. Maybe not likeliness, but whether or not they should be based off WAR and that kind of stuff.
Worthiness.
But yes, thank you. But Wagner's I right behind Trevor Hoffman. He's top 7, I think. And Andrew Jones was just one of the best fielders of all time before he turned 30. He had amazing power too, but as soon as he turned 30, just dealt with injuries and stuff. But I think that those are both very good picks for somebody who could get in before they reach their 10 years on the ballot.
And like you mentioned with the Veterans Committee, and I personally think that's why Curt Schilling has taken such a dip. Obviously, counting in the fact that he's the most inflammatory person on the ballot. But he flat out came out and said last time after he didn't get voted in, don't vote for me anymore. I'll just get in on the Veterans Committee. And he's just content to do that. So I think that's why he's taken such a major drop down to 58.1%. And I really wish that more votes were going to guys that, in my opinion, should get in, like, Todd Helton and like Scott Rowland.
Yes.
And Bobby Abreu, Jeff Kent. But looking down further at the list, I know there's quite a few guys in the red in danger of falling off. I know you need 5% to stay on the ballot. You got guys like Burley, Joe Nathan, Tim Hudson, Lincecum, Torrey Hunter, guys like that. In my opinion, the Billy Wagner debate is really important for the future of Hall of Fame voting. I think, you let Mariano Rivera in. Obviously, he's the best reliever that's ever played. Trevor Hoffman, you could make an argument. He's not as good as Mo, but he's still an excellent player. If Billy Wagner gets in, you set a precedent for the rest of these relievers. If Billy Wagner gets in, you have to start making an argument for Joe Nathan. You could probably make an argument for Jonathan Papelbon. He's not as good in the regular season as Joe Nathan, but he's a pretty good postseason career relief pitcher. But, you got guys like Joe Nathan who've got 2.7% of the vote, and there are 9 players with an ERA plus of 150 or more that have pitched 900 innings, and Billy Wagner and Joe Nathan are on that list. And there's some pretty elite names on that list. Mariano Rivera, for a start. I believe Sandy Koufax is also on that list. I mean, you can craft an argument for any of these guys on the list, bar the ones at the bottom that just don't have a chance. The big crux of the argument this year is the steroid guys. It's Barry Bonds and Clemens last year. Everyone knows that. But it's also the first year for guys like A-Rod and Manny Ramirez. And I want to see how you guys feel about them, because I have my own thoughts about them, and I'll share them after you guys go. But what do you guys think about A-Rod and Manny, who are both around 44.6 and 40.5% respectively?
I think they're right where they belong right now, simply based off how they have voted for guys like Barry Bonds and stuff. I think they both deserve to get into the Hall of Fame at some point, but they should, because basically what I look for, I want to see consistency with the votership. Like, I think that's really what Jake was leading on, like when it came to like Ortiz versus the Edgar thing, because there's no question that Ortiz should probably be in the Hall of Fame. It's just, why did Edgar have to wait for so long? So we got to be consistent. I do think A-Rod should eventually get in. If Barry Bonds gets in this year, I think that's really what it weighs on. Because if you're not going to let Barry Bonds in and he falls off the ballot, then you can't let A-Rod in. You can't let Manny in. You can't let any other PED linked guy in my opinion, anyway. Because that's something this league has kind of struggled with, is consistency. And I think that's where I stand with it. So if they have to wait 15 years and then eventually get in, that's fine with me. But they do got to stay on the ballot. I don't want to see them all fit completely, especially A-Rod, because you can make an argument, like, even for his defensive ability, like, he's one of the better shortstops of his time. Probably even better than Derek Jeter, let's be honest, right? I mean, I say probably because I'm
way better.
I'm trying to go easy on him. Let's not do this.
He was the best shortstop on his own team his whole career. Yeah,
you could argue. I mean, the only thing with A-Rod, of course, he did multiple times, multiple offender, threw everybody under the bus. It was very ugly. I am not really a fan of A-Rod, to be honest. I like his post-baseball career. I like him as a commentator. I think he's really fun to watch. You can tell he really loves the game. But yes, they got to get the same type of treatment that Barry Bonds has got.
I'm gonna have to disagree on what you just said, because, like we were talking about with Ortiz being not indicted, but being mentioned in a early 2000s performance-enhancing drug test, Rob Manfred shot those down, and because they were so early on and produced so many false positives that none of those performance-enhancing drug tests could really be used for what we have now. And for players like A-Rod and Manny, they played so deep into the 2000s, past 2010, or close to it, that they were in the era of not being allowed to use performance enhancing drugs. And so players like Bonds and Clemens and stuff, they were in an era before they were banned. Obviously they weren't doing the right thing. Obviously now they would be suspended for it, but it was in an era when it wasn't punished. But when Manny and A-Rod did it, they were doing it when it was already established that it was going to be a problem if you got caught doing steroids. And with Manny Ramirez, he got caught multiple times. And A-Rod, obviously, I don't know if he did it later in his career with the Yankees, but he said that he did it as a member of the Rangers when he was having some of his best statistical seasons. Now, I do think A-Rod deserves to be in because he is without a doubt maybe the best shortstop of all time. And Manny has some great statistics, but I think with Manny that you can't say that his statistics are driven by PEDs because of what he did in the 90s and stuff as a member of the Indians. But when he was on the Dodgers and stuff, getting busted almost every year, it seemed like I think that's pretty fair. And with A-Rod also, it's like he was not totally loved by really anybody during his playing career, like fellow players. I know he had a rough relationship with Jeter. I know he had a rough relationship with the media, and he wasn't too great with fans some of the times. And now he's been trying to fix that image, but I don't know if that's going to be enough because we know for a fact that he did steroids during a time when it was not okay.
Yeah, my opinion on it is kind of similar to Jake's. I kind of split them up into two different categories, if we're honest. I honestly, I think Bonds and Clemens deserve to be in. They played in a time where PEDs were treated like the Wild West. You could do basically whatever. And like you said, it wasn't the right thing to do. But everyone did it. Does that excuse it? Not really. But A-Rod and Manny played well into a time where the precedent was set. You cannot do it. And I'm all for forgiving steroids, but I think you need to be in an upper echelon. You need to be an inner circle Hall of Famer for me to consider it. And I don't think Manny is. I really don't think Manny's an inner circle Hall of Famer. And it's the same with Andy Pettitte. I know he was I believe he was implicated with Balco. I don't know if he ever admitted. I think he did admit to using steroids. But, you've got guys like that. I don't think they're Hall of Famers, and I don't think they'll ever be Hall of Famers because of that reason. It's the same thing with guys like Gary Sheffield. Gary Sheffield also was implicated with Balco, and it's pretty obvious he used. Let's not kid ourselves. He most likely used. But I don't think he ever failed the test. So I think you have to treat players differently based on the situation that they were in. Did Barry Bonds use? Yes, absolutely. You can look at him and tell. Like, he used. Roger Clemens, same thing. But Roger Clemens is arguably the greatest pitcher ever. At least the greatest modern pitcher ever. And Barry Bonds is arguably the greatest hitter that's ever lived. You have to separate them in your mind. And for me, I think what you said about Alex Rodriguez has done a lot to repair his image. And I think that goes a long way towards helping him. He was not a loved player, not even by most Yankees fans. He was kind of the past generation's Giancarlo Stanton. Good, great player, gets a ton of hate, but it is what it is.
Absolutely.
I think you just have to separate them in your mind. So basing the argument for guys like that, who are ones that you think will get in the next few years? You've got the three at the top right now: Clemens, Bonds, and Ortiz. Do you think that A-Rod will get in the next few years, or do you think he'll have to wait his turn?
I definitely think he's gonna have to wait his turn, and I actually could agree when it comes to like the Manny argument. But I think A-Rod gets in, because his numbers are undeniable. And to be honest, look, baseball, they did. Was it lawed out in 1990, right, when they started? But they didn't police PEDs until 2003, and that's why I actually wrote that piece about Barry Bonds, where I feel like it's finally his turn to get in, because the blame goes on Major League Baseball more than anybody else. Hey, you didn't police it, and he got away with it. But I will say this in terms of Bonds did do it when technically it was illegal and ruled out in the league. A-Rod did it. It's just that he got caught, multiple times. But Manny, he got ousted from the league. So, maybe I would scale back a bit on Manny. But yeah, I think A-Rod eventually gets in. But like I said, I'm looking for consistency. So if he is getting in, I'm waiting till his last year on the ballot. And that's when, if I was voting, I'm not voting him until the end, just because that's what Barry Bonds has had to do. And rightfully so, by the way. I'm not arguing that Barry Bonds should have gotten in earlier, but it is time now. And that's it. I think the same precedent will follow for every other player.
Yeah. I think one important thing to point out about the players that are up for the Hall of Fame right now that have been indicted for PEDs during the 90s is they allowed the commissioner, Bud Selig, they elected him to the Hall of Fame just a few years ago. And he was the one who saw everything that was going on during that time and said, A-okay with me. I want more fans to come watch while we have this McGuire Sosa home run chase. So if he's in, I don't think that's really fair to let all the other guys who also knew what was going on not in. So I think that's important to point out. But going off of Davis's question, thank you. Going off of Davis's question, I definitely see, like I said earlier, I see Rowland getting in soon. This is Schilling's last year on the ballot, so he won't be getting in. But players like Helton is definitely going to get in. Andrew Jones has a very good chance. I think Sheffield has even got a chance because I don't know how late he tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs or if he was just in Balco. But Wagner will get in, and I think Kent is misrepresented sometimes. People don't talk about him a lot, and I think that's partially because he was sort of a jerk during his playing time, not only to his teammates, but to media and stuff. But he is the all-time leader in home runs by second baseman. So I think that by itself means that he should get in, especially playing as a teammate to Barry Bonds. And he's got no indictments of performance-enhancing drugs or anything. And then I also think Bobby Abreu should get in, but I'm not sure since he's at 12.2% right now. I think it's his third or fourth year on the ballot. But he is one of the biggest, I think, SABR-driven cases that we have out there because was such a good fielder and had such an amazing on-base percentage. It's literally just, I think him and Ken Griffey Sr. were the only ones to I forget what this exact stat was that I came up with, but some of the best plate discipline and fielding that we have seen in the past 20 years from Bobby Abreu there.
I just want to really quickly ask you guys. I just want to hear your opinion. I'm kind of curious. So when you look at guys like Bobby Abreu, right, the numbers don't jump off the plate in terms of stats, but when you consider the fact that they did it the right way, as far as we know, no PEDs, do you think their stats should be amplified a bit more than they are because they played clean, or do you think they should just be taken at face value as they are?
You mean just the players that played during the steroid era, or even players now that
Well, a little bit of both. Well, maybe more or less during the steroid era. We look at Mike Messina, who got in, right? His ERA wasn't the greatest, but when you consider the era that he played in, he got in, and rightfully so, in my opinion. Do you think that they should follow that a little bit more for a guy like Bobby Abreu, who I don't think he will get in, but I do think there's a real argument for him?
For me, I think it. Go ahead, Jake.
No, you got it.
For me, I think it helps a little bit, but I think you already need to be close. And I think it goes along with something that's also Hall of Fame related that I'll bring up in a little bit. Everyone brings up the character clause. And I think the character clause so often is used to devalidate a player getting in and never used the other way around as to, hey, this guy really did it the right way and should get in. Scott Rowland, he played at the tail end of the steroid era and he never tested positive. One of the greatest fielders of all time. Great hitting third baseman. And Todd Helton, the same thing. Todd Helton's an excellent player that's really being overlooked, one, because of the strength of the ballot, but also because, his stats also don't really jump off the page. I think he has the 300, 400, 500, but that's it. I think you do have to make an argument for certain guys, but they need to be close. I don't think you can just go and be like, oh, well, someone like, I don't know, for example, but I think they need to be close. I don't think you can just create an argument of, oh yeah, they were pretty good during the steroid era, so then let's let them in.
Jake, I think you're muted unless it's me.
Thank you. No, that was me. I definitely think it's hard to increase players in that sense because we don't really know who's really did it and who really didn't, especially with the players that we have on the ballot right now. We're not really 100% sure about any of them, except for maybe Manny Ramirez and A-Rod, since they pretty much said that they did. But I think to say that like somebody didn't do steroids and therefore we should boost up their statistics is like saying like, oh, this guy didn't play in Coors, let's see what his stats would be in Coors and boost them that way. Like it's so hypothetical. But taking somebody like Abreu, like there's definitely ways where you can look at it and look at his overall just like basic regular stats, like his home run total or his batting average. But those are stats that like, I mean, they obviously matter, but I don't think they tell a whole story. Like I pulled up this article where I wrote about Abreu, and among right fielders who played at least as many seasons as Abreu, which he played 18, only Elmer Vallow, Paul Waner, Mel Ott, Stan Musial, and Babe Ruth have a higher career on-base percentage than Abreu's 395. And I know that's just one stat, but that doesn't include his over 200 home runs, his over 400 stolen bases. And I think there's going to be more players like that as we get more into the voting in the 2020s, because we'll have lots of players that have cases based off advanced statistics and who were more valuable during this era of on-base percentage and that kind of stuff. And I think that also goes into the Billy Wagner conversation we were having earlier, where once he gets in, that really opens the door for a lot of other relievers, not because he's not good enough to qualify, but just because it'll open people's eyes more to relievers that could rack up a ton of strikeouts with a great ERA and maybe not always be the closer, but be just elite all the time.
Yeah, and bridging back to Wagner for a second, I mean, it's players like that that are important in my mind for the future of Hall of Fame voting. And I said that earlier, but I mean, you know, Wagner gets in, you can then craft an argument when they retire. You can craft an argument for Aroldis Chapman, and you can craft an argument for Craig Kimbrell. You know, it's guys like that that will probably need a little bit of help to get in. And like with Bobby Abreu, it could do the same thing for different guys that are already in the league, or even past guys that need consideration on the Veterans Committee. You know, there are guys that have been overlooked in Hall of Fame voting that really should be in, like Dick Allen, you know, and various other players that just need a little extra consideration. But I really do think that it's important that you can make a separation between guys like Abreu that really merit at least deep consideration, even if they don't get in, you know, and guys like, I'll just use Sammy Sosa for an example. You know, Sammy Sosa hit 500 home runs. We were talking about that before the show, but he didn't really do anything else. And I'm a Cubs fan. I love Sammy Sosa, but he doesn't deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. Like, you need to be able to separate the different arguments. And I really like, especially mentioning earlier, the disconnect between counting stats and advanced analytics for certain cases, because I think you need to use them hand in hand.
Yep. I think might be some technical difficulties over there. I don't know if it's just me.
No, he's back.
Okay.
All right, he's back. Go ahead.
Okay, so I don't know how much of that you guys heard, but
advanced analytics.
Yeah, I think using counting stats with advanced analytics can help you make a better argument towards a certain player. Like if you look at one or the other, like I'll use WAR for example. Jeff Kent doesn't have very high WAR that jumps off the page at you, but Jeff Kent's also one of the career WAR leaders at second base. Like you need to be able to make an argument. You know, Bobby Abreu, I think something that actually really hurts Bobby Abreu is the position he played. He played right field, and right field is so loaded in the Hall of Fame.
Yes,
that it's difficult for you to look off the page, especially for older voters that won't use the advanced analytics and just say like, "Oh, Bobby Abreu, Hall of Famer." But I mean, also now you got Harold Baines in the Hall of Fame, so you need to be able to look at both sides.
Yeah.
It's just Hall of Fame voting is so weird.
Yeah.
And nonsensical that it does need a change. So guys like this can be considered. I don't like the keep the hall small idea. I think that's really dumb. I think if someone deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, they deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. And that's just how it is.
Yeah. That I agree with, because you just asked the question, is this guy a Hall of Famer? Okay, so why are we waiting 10 years to put this guy in again? So so there definitely needs to be some sort of reform. I agree with you there.
Yeah, I don't want it to be like the NBA Hall of Fame where everyone gets in regardless of what they did. But if someone deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, they ought to go in.
Well, the thing too because at least it's the Basketball Hall of Fame, so at least that kind of makes sense, in a sense where it's like you take into account their college accomplishments, their Olympics, and all that stuff. But it is a little bit too looser, Guy's an all-star, he's probably getting into the Hall of Fame. So, so yes, I definitely agree there.
I mean, there's also just a ton more players in baseball. You have a 26-man roster compared to, is it 12 in basketball? So that's more than double. Just every year you've got more players playing. So that just leaves even more players available to be voted in, which means if you lower the bar, that just makes the Hall of Fame exponentially bigger. So I also want people that are on the borderline to get in, but it's hard to pick and choose which ones.
Yeah. Right. I agree with that. So now that we've really covered our bases on the Hall of Fame, let's jump more into the next season, if we have one. Jake wrote a fantastic article about the top 25 fantasy starting pitchers for the upcoming season. We have it linked on our site, obviously.
Yes.
But I know there are a couple that Jake would like to discuss, and I'll let Jake have the floor.
Go for it.
All right. So I'm a big fantasy baseball player. I love fantasy baseball. I'm getting into more NFBC stuff this next year, which is really high stakes fantasy. You got to pay a lot to get in. That's why I've never done it before, because I am not one to have lots of money to spend on that kind of stuff. But nonetheless, I do my own rankings every single year, and that has helped me do very well in my home league. I've three-peated, actually. 3 straight championships.
Humble brag.
So I decided to post my rankings this year, and I started with the top 25. I'll be coming out with the 26 through 50, I think, next week or the week after that. But there are a few players I would like to discuss. Starting with my number 9 starting pitcher for fantasy next year is going to be Sandy Alcantara of the Miami Marlins. He was one of my favorite players last year. I really thought that he was a super good value going pretty late in drafts. And I just thought he was undervalued because coming off of the 2020 season, there were so many players that we didn't know whether or not they would be able to replicate what they did in 2020, and also whether or not they'd be able to have the volume that they needed to be a good starting pitcher, whether or not they'd get the innings pitched to be relevant in fantasy baseball. And Alcantara, with his age and his previous experience of throwing almost 200 innings in a season, I just thought that he was a great bet. And it turned out even better than I thought it was going to be, as he was one of the best starting pitchers in the National League, especially in the second half when he was one of the biggest movers in strikeout to walk ratio. And it's because he has a blazing fastball. He can touch over 100 miles per hour. He's very similar to Zach Wheeler. Both of them have a fastball, a four-seamer, a sinker, and a devastating slider that they pair with a really sneaky changeup that they can go in there with. And I think with Alcantara early on, he was focusing a lot on his fastball and changeup, and then he stuck to his slider a lot more in the second half, and that really helped get him a lot of whiffs and rack up those strikeouts, and that's what led to the increase in strikeout to walk ratio. And I was wondering what you guys think of Sandy Alcantara heading into next year, because I think he could be a Cy Young candidate. I think he's my favorite. He's my pick for NL Cy Young next year. So I don't know what you guys think about him.
I had a tough time also not picking him for NL Cy Young. I just can't bet against DeGrom for the NL Cy Young. But I really like Alcantara, other than the one experience that I actually have I've seen mostly highlights. The one experience watching a game was him shutting out the Cubs, so that was really good. But yeah, I really think he's really nasty, and I think the Marlins actually have a really good up and coming roster, especially with their rotation and their bullpen. They're going to be they're not an easy out anymore, and he's part of the main reason.
You know, it's funny. I mean, we're probably going to discuss more of our like predictions for the season, but we do have the article on theathletesub.org if you guys want to get a little head start. But I was so tempted with my bold prediction to go ahead and say the Marlins might be a playoff team. I just can't put them really above the Mets. There's just too much competition right now. But I think you take this roster and you put them into a lot of past seasons, and I think this would be a playoff team. Just not quite there yet. But, yeah, their pitching rotation is really good, almost like the Blue Jays of the National League, in my opinion. Like just
with no offense.
With no offense. But, you got Jazz Prism. That's my guy, man. I got him on my fantasy team. Drafted him since the beginning. You have some names there. Of course, losing Marte is going to hurt a little, in the long run. But, the Marlins are a really good team, man. And yeah, Alcantara, I mean, he has a really good supporting cast as well in that rotation. So I don't do too much of the fantasy baseball. That's more of Jake's scene. But I do like in any ranking, you put Sandy Alcantara in there. So.
Yeah, so I'll move on to the next guy. Like I said, I had Sandy in the top 10 at number 9. So now we'll be moving a couple tiers later to number 17, Max Fried, who is a pitcher for the Braves. If you were watching the playoffs last year, if you were watching the World Series, you definitely saw him. He was pretty amazing. And the one thing to point out for him last year was that he struggled with injuries and inefficiencies in the first couple of months, and then turned it around and was amazing the rest of the season. In the first half, he had a 4.71 ERA in 72 innings, and then had more innings in the second half because he was obviously dealing with injuries in that first half, and he pitched to a 1.74 ERA in that second half. And that was just allowing him to be healthy and get into the rhythm of things. We've seen him always be one of the best pitchers in the league because he can limit hard contact with his amazing curveball placement. But the biggest thing that holds him back from ranking inside the top 15 or even the top 10, if you completely believe in his second half performance, which was backed up by a 2.74 fielding independent pitching, is that he doesn't strike out a lot of guys. In his 165 innings last year, he only struck out 158. So obviously that's less than the strikeout per 9 innings, or less than a strikeout per inning, less than 9 strikeout per 9 innings. And he's only projected for 185 with 185 innings pitched next year. So that's the one knock on him, is that he's not an elite strikeout pitcher like you want in fantasy baseball and like all the pitchers ahead of him. But he is basically the best guarantee to have elite ratios heading into 2022. What do you guys think?
So you went with more of a high floor, medium ceiling kind of guy.
Yeah, I love floor guys. Early on, you want to be drafting floor because you want to put yourself with the least amount of risk as possible in your fantasy drafts. That's
interesting. Like, hearing you say that, because I think the next guy that you're talking about, I'm gonna need some convincing on him. I know he had a really good season last year, but do you trust him long term? Like, I don't know. Like, I to be honest, I think I traded him too in my league for before the season started. I definitely lost that deal. But long term, how are you feeling about Mr. Gausman?
With Gausman, I really liked him last year. Obviously, I'm a Giants fan. He did great with them in 2020, and then when he signed the qualifying offer, he was great. He was even better last year in 2021. But I think there's a lot that people are missing out on with him. Last year, he pitched to a 2.81 ERA with a 1.0 for WHIP and 227 strikeouts, which is elite. I'm pretty sure that made him a top 10 starter in all formats. But nonetheless, he is coming off of career season. He's leaving the team that turned him into the pitcher that he was last year, a team that's great at working with veterans. And he's leaving a great pitcher's park in Oracle Park and moving to Rogers Center, which is notably not a great pitcher's park, very good for hitters, and in the NL East, or AL East, which is a much more difficult division than the NL West, and has very tough offenses and tough parks, including Fenway and Yankee Stadium, obviously. And on top of that, he struggled in the second half last year, which brought his numbers down a lot. He had a 4.42 ERA and a 1.37 WHIP in 77 innings with a 27% strikeout rate. So that points to if he continues that, he is not going to be worth his draft cost right now. He's got an ADP of 56, which is very high. And he also just signed a huge contract, which makes it puts a lot of pressure on him to perform immediately. And as you could see with who they signed last offseason, George Springer, he not only struggled with injuries, but he was pretty good last year, but he wasn't natural George Springer as he had been before on the Astros in his first year as a Blue Jay. And one more thing, he uses a volatile secondary pitch in his splitter, and which is a pitch that it's a very feel pitch because you're trying to get the ball very in between your fingers. And if you don't have the right feel, it's not going to be performing like it usually does. And he used that pitch 36.6% of the time last year, meaning it was his secondary pitch. And so without that, he's relying on a slider that he rarely used last year and a fastball that isn't one of the best in the league. So I think there's so much going against him next year that it's going to be hard to buy into him, especially inside the top 60, top 75. I wouldn't take him inside the top 100. I don't think.
So in other words, there's still some hope for that deal, right? I traded him. I'll be honest, I sold really low for some ungodly reason. So there's still a chance that I didn't completely lose yet, right? Like for future. Is basically what you're saying.
No, he's got a lot to encounter, but he's definitely, with the way he performed last year, he could just come back out and have some really good luck and do it again. But I don't see that, especially with his projection of a 3.87 ERA and a 1.19 WHIP. It's sort of, those are pretty mediocre numbers for a player that's supposed to be your ace on your fantasy teams. And so I would take him as my number 3. I don't think I'm staying away next year in fantasy drafts. There's just too much for him to overcome.
Interesting. Davis, where are you at?
Knowing Gossman from the few starts that I've actually watched Gossman, when he's on, he's on. When he's off, he's off. And it really depends, like you said, on his splitter. His splitter's his go-to out pitch. It just is. It's nasty when it's on. It's one of the best pitches in the National League when he's really dialed in with it. But when it isn't, it hangs. And hanging a splitter in Yankee Stadium and Fenway Park, maybe not the best idea. I don't play fantasy baseball, but I play a lot of fantasy football. And it seems to me like he's the antithesis of your idea of high floor guy. He seems like a high ceiling guy and a really, really low floor guy. If he just comes out and gets touched up in a really tough division, I mean, you wasted a really high draft pick for nothing, for no production. Mm-hmm. And I do like Gossman, and I really like the Blue Jays, and I think their rotation is really nasty, but they do not play in a hitter-friendly park at all. Rogers isn't a cavern, and it's not the short porch that Yankee Stadium has, but it's a really offensive-friendly environment with definitely not as great a defense behind him as the Giants gave him, I don't think. They lost, especially losing out on Simeon. Their infield defense is not the best. I like Vlad. I think he's a solid first baseman, and I like Bo, but I don't think he's an excellent defensive shortstop. Their outfield defense is like George Springer, Teoscar Hernandez, and whoever on earth. Well, I think Kevin Biggio would probably play right field. Oh, that's over for that guy then. But yeah, I like Gossman, but I would also stay away if I were to draft.
I gotta say, you said one thing that really stuck out to me. You said it's not really a good idea to leave a hanging pitch in Yankee Stadium. I think it's a great idea, to be honest, especially against like a guy like Giancarlo Stanton or Aaron Judge. I'm all for it. Bring it. Let's do it.
Giancarlo Stanton gets way too much hate from you guys.
I love Giancarlo.
He does. I'm gonna be on my Yankee fans all season on this show, just like I've been on my Knicks fans for how they treat Julius Randle. I'm gonna be on them for how they treat Giancarlo Stanton. That dude is a lot better than they give him credit for, and I knew it. It's just how Yankee fans are. Like, I'm a Yankee fan, but you see Joey Gallo, like how he was being treated. You knew what you were gonna get the moment he arrived. Granted, his play level was a little bit. That's a story for another day. Okay, before I go off on my Yankee. So, is there any last remarks? I don't know. I think we're about at the end, fellas. We did really good here.
I think this is all we've got for today. Make sure you guys tune in. I think we're doing this every other Monday. Next time we'll get into our way too early 2022 MLB predictions for the season. A couple other things. Come back and watch us and hang out. We're always down to talk baseball. Follow us at our @ that are on the ticker below, and just keep at it. Anything you guys want to
add? Check out all of our articles. And I'll be coming out with another top starting pitchers article very soon, and I've got a offensive breakouts one that's coming out probably this week, in a couple days. And I spent a lot of time on that one, so would love everybody to check that one out. Very in depth, very statistical.
I gotta say,
Jake has been
Jake has been killing it with these ranking articles, by the way. So definitely got to check those out. Both of these guys are the numbers that run through their head. They're like mathematicians when it comes to baseball. I'm more of like the rough take kind of guy. So it's gonna be a lot of fun doing this show with you guys. I appreciate it, and I guess we're about at the end.
All right.
Thanks, guys. See you next week. 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks until the season begins. Then we will be going on a weekly basis. That said, everybody have a good week. Thank you so much.
All right.